oasis of survival, a place where the law was often a distant echo and justice had a rugged face. The frontier became a crucible for legends. As settlers pushed westward, lured by the promise of opportunity, they encountered a landscape that was both beautiful and brutal. The gold and silver rushes sparked a feverish wave of migration, transforming sleepy towns into bustling, rowdy centres of commerce and conflict. Here, amid the dust and gun smoke, men and women sought to carve out new lives, even as they grappled with the constant threat of violence and uncertainty. In these lawless lands, the figure of the lawman emerged as a beacon of order, or sometimes as a force just as fearsome as the outlaws they pursued. This was the era of the Wild West, a time when larger-than-life personalities like Wyatt Earp became synonymous with the struggle for control over an unruly frontier. Yet, the reality of the Wild West was often far removed from the romanticised tales spun by dime novels and the imaginations of Easterners who had never set foot on its dusty trails. The truth was grittier, marked by the daily grind of survival and the unpredictable sway of fate. For every story of heroism, there were countless untold tales of hardship, betrayal, and loss. Before we continue, I want to welcome you to the ASMR History Hub. To returning viewers, thank you for your ongoing support. I really appreciate it. To new viewers, welcome to my channel. I hope you enjoy your stay and be sure to leave a comment with topic suggestions for future videos. Now, getting back to the video, today I invite you to journey with me into the story of Wyatt Earp and his war against the Cowboys. He was a figure both revered and reviled, whose name has become emblematic of the Old West. In this story, we will peel back the layers of myth to reveal the man behind the legend, a journey that takes us from his turbulent early years to his emergence as a formidable lawman in some of the West's most notorious towns. Wyatt Earp's story begins far from the arid deserts of Arizona in the small town of Monmouth, Illinois. Born on March 19th, 1848, Wyatt was one of 8 children in a family that seemed destined to roam. His father, Nicholas Earp, was a restless spirit, part farmer, part cooper, and at times a local politician whose ambitions and troubles led the family on the relentless westward march. With every move, young Wyatt absorbed lessons that would later define his approach to life and law: resilience, adaptability, and a keen understanding of the often blurred lines between right and wrong. As the Earp family drifted across the young nation, from Illinois to Iowa, and eventually to California, Wyatt grew up in the shadow of his father's diverse ventures and strict sense of justice. Nicholas Earp, a man of many trades, also had a strong belief in the law, serving in various civic roles wherever they settled. It was under this complex figure that Wyatt first glimpsed the paradoxical nature of law and order, a framework that was both a shield and a weapon, depending on who wielded it. The its frequent relocations and shifting fortunes, provided a formative backdrop for a young boy learning to navigate a world where authority was often as uncertain as the frontier itself. Wyatt's early years were marked by moments of both promise and peril. As a teenager, he joined his father in California during the tail end of the gold rush, a move that exposed him to the raw, often brutal reality of frontier life. Here, amid the sprawling camps and boomtowns, Wyatt saw firsthand the chaos that could ensue in a world without established rules. The lessons learned during this period were harsh, but they laid the groundwork for a man who would become both feared and respected as a keeper of the peace. Yet, for all his exposure to law and order, Wyatt's path was far from straightforward. His first marriage to a young woman named Urilla Sutherland seemed to promise a stable and settled life, but tragedy struck quickly and cruelly when Urilla died of typhoid fever within months of their wedding, leaving Wyatt devastated and adrift. In his grief, he turned away from the path of lawfulness he had begun to tread, descending instead into a darker world. Arrested for horse theft in Arkansas, a crime that would haunt him for years, Wyatt found himself at a crossroads. This period of lawlessness was a crucible for his character, a time when he flirted with the very darkness he would later combat as a lawman. It was in the midst of these personal and legal troubles that Wyatt began to find his footing. The turn came almost unexpectedly when he was offered a position as a constable in Lamar, Missouri. The shift from outlaw to lawman was not just a change of profession, it was a deliberate choice to step onto a path that demanded both discipline and courage. Lamar was only the beginning. Soon, Wyatt moved on to Wichita and then Dodge City, Kansas, towns that were the very embodiment of the Wild West, with their saloons, gambling halls, and frequent brawls spilling into the dusty streets. In Dodge City, Wyatt Earp's reputation as a tough, no-nonsense lawman began to take shape. It was here that he faced down some of the West's most notorious outlaws, cementing his status as a man who would not back down in the face of danger. The stories from this period are legendary, tales of tense standoffs and swift justice that spread Wyatt's fame far and wide. One such story, often told in hushed tones, involves the arrest of Ben Thompson, a feared gunslinger. Wyatt, with his characteristic calm and unyielding resolve, walked up to Thompson and disarmed him without a shot fired. It was a display of both strategic brilliance and raw nerve, qualities that would define Wyatt's approach to law enforcement for the rest of his life. Reflecting on his life and choices, Wyatt would later say, "I learned early on that the badge doesn't make a man. It's the actions he takes that define him." This philosophy guided him through his many years as a lawman, shaping his decisions in times of crisis and his approach to justice in an unforgiving world. It is a sentiment that speaks to the heart of his character, a recognition that true authority comes not from a symbol of power, but from the integrity and courage to stand up for what is right, even when it is not easy. As Wyatt Earp's legend grew, so did the myths that surrounded him. He was a man who straddled the line between law and lawlessness, a figure as complex as the frontier itself. And it was in the dusty, burgeoning town of Tombstone, Arizona, that Wyatt would face his greatest challenges and achieve his most enduring fame. This was the place where the lawman's resolve would be tested, where the lines between justice and vengeance would blur, and where Wyatt Earp would forever etch his name into the annals of American history. Now, let's delve deeper into Wyatt's rise to prominence in Tombstone, a journey marked by fierce loyalty, violent confrontations, and a pursuit of justice that would culminate in one of the most famous gunfights of the Old West. Wyatt Earp arrived in Tombstone, Arizona, with his brothers in late 1879, drawn by the silver boom that promised fortunes to those daring enough to chase them. Tombstone was more than just a town. It was a promise of prosperity and a fresh start, a place where Wyatt could shed the shadows of his past and carve out a new identity. The lure of silver was irresistible, not just for the Earp brothers, but for thousands of others who flocked to the rugged frontier town, hoping to strike it rich. But for Wyatt and his brothers, Virgil and Morgan, Tombstone represented more than just financial opportunity. It was a chance to build influence and control in a place where law and fortune were often intertwined. Tombstone in the late 1870s was a town caught between two worlds. On the one hand, there was the gleam of silver and the promise of wealth. On the other, a rough and lawless edge where anything could happen, and often did. The streets were filled with a mix of miners, ranchers, businessmen, gamblers, and outlaws, creating a volatile cocktail of wealth and vice. Saloons and brothels stood shoulder to shoulder with banks and general stores, each catering to a different clientele, but equally vital to the town's economy. It was a place where fortunes were made and lost overnight, where the line between respectability and infamy was often blurred. The air was thick with the dust of passing stagecoaches and the tension of a community that was always on the brink of violence. The Earp brothers quickly found their footing in this complex environment, taking on a variety of roles that would establish them as key figures in Tombstone. Virgil Earp, with his experience in law enforcement, became the town marshal, a position that placed him at the heart of Tombstone's often chaotic efforts to maintain some semblance of order. Wyatt and Morgan, meanwhile, dabbled in a mix of law enforcement, gambling, and business investments, each venture providing a different kind of leverage in a town where power was as fluid as the shifting desert sands. Wyatt, with his reputation already well known from his time in Dodge City, soon became a deputy sheriff under his brother Virgil, a role that put him on a collision course with Tombstone's more unsavoury elements. The political landscape in Tombstone was the silver mines that dotted the surrounding hills. The town was a hotbed of tension, not just between individuals, but between political factions that vied for control over the lucrative silver trade and the equally profitable world of gambling and vice. The Earps, aligning themselves with the Republican interests, quickly found themselves at odds with the Democrats, who had the backing of the so-called Cowboys, a loose-knit group of rustlers and outlaws who operated on both sides of the law. At the centre of this political struggle was Johnny Behan, the sheriff of Cochise County, whose allegiance the Cowboys made him a natural rival to the Earps. Behan was a man who played the political game with skill, using his position to maintain a delicate balance of power in a town where the stakes were always high. From the outset, tensions between the Earps and Behan simmered just below the surface, occasionally boiling over into public disputes that left no doubt about the animosity between the two camps. Behan and the Cowboys were often seen as lax in their enforcement of the law, turning a blind eye to the rustling and smuggling operations that were rampant in the area. The Earps, in contrast, were determined to bring order to Tombstone, seeing themselves as the last line of defence against the chaos that threatened to engulf the town. This clash of philosophies and interests quickly led to conflict, with each side accusing the other of corruption and incompetence. The rising tensions with the Cowboy gang only added fuel to the fire. The Cowboys were not just a gang, they were a powerful force in the region, controlling much of the illegal trade that flowed across the border with Mexico. The Earp brothers, in their capacity as lawmen, made several attempts to crack down on the Cowboys' operations, seizing cattle they believed to be stolen and arresting members of the gang whenever they could. These actions, while lawful, were not without consequence. Every arrest, every raid, every act of enforcement was seen as a challenge to the Cowboys' authority, a provocation that could not go unanswered. Wyatt's role as a lawman in Tombstone grew more prominent with each passing day. Known for his ability to keep a cool head in a crisis, he navigated the dangerous waters of Tombstone's politics with a mix of diplomacy and force. He was a man who understood that the badge alone was not enough to command respect. It was the actions he took, the stands he made, that defined his authority. Whether breaking up a bar fight without ever drawing his gun, or using his sharp mind to outmaneuver his opponents, Wyatt Earp became a symbol of law and order in a town that desperately needed both. But Wyatt also knew that he could not maintain order alone. He began to forge alliances with other like-minded individuals, including Doc Holliday, a dentist turned gambler and gunfighter, whose skills with a six-shooter were matched only by his loyalty to his friends. Holliday, a man with a quick temper and a quicker draw, became one of Wyatt's closest allies, a member of the small but determined group that stood against the growing influence of the Cowboy gang. Together with his brothers and a few other trusted lawmen, Wyatt formed a tight-knit circle of enforcers who were dedicated to keeping the peace, even if it meant facing down the most dangerous men in Tombstone. As Wyatt's reputation grew, so did his list of enemies. The Cowboys saw him as a direct threat to their way of life, a lawman who was determined to disrupt their operations and challenge their control over the region. Each encounter with the Cowboys, whether in the streets of Tombstone or out on the open plains, was a test of wills, a contest to see who would back down first. But Wyatt was not a man who backed down. He met every challenge head on, using a combination of courage, cunning, and sheer determination to uphold the law, even when it seemed like the entire town was arrayed against him. Yet, despite the mounting tensions and the constant threat of violence, Wyatt remained committed to his role as a lawman. He understood that the stakes were higher than just his personal reputation or even the safety of his family. It was about the very soul of Tombstone itself, in a town where justice was often for sale and the law could be bent to suit those in power. Wyatt Earp stood as a figure of integrity, a man who believed in the ideals of fairness and order, even when the reality was far more complex. But the Cowboy gang was not a group that could be easily subdued. They were the outlaws of the West, men who lived by their own code and answered to no one but themselves. The coming storm between the Earps and the Cowboys would be more than just a clash of personalities. It would be a battle for the future of Tombstone, a showdown that would leave its mark on the annals of American history. As we turn our gaze now to these infamous outlaws, the Cowboys of the West, we'll explore who they were, what they stood for, and why their paths would inevitably cross with that of Wyatt Earp, leading to one of the most legendary conflicts the Wild West would ever see. The Cowboy gang wasn't just a band of misfits. They were the very embodiment of the lawless spirit of the Wild West. Their origins were as rugged as the land they roamed, drawing together a loose alliance of ranch hands turned outlaws, cattle rustlers, and opportunistic criminals who thrived on the fringes of society. Unlike the organised criminal syndicates of later years, the Cowboys were a ragtag group, bound not by strict codes or rigid hierarchies, but by a shared desire to live free from the constraints of law and order. They drifted into Tombstone from the surrounding countryside, lured by the prospect of easy money and the promise of a town where they could bend the rules or break them altogether. The Cowboys weren't a single unified gang, but rather a loosely connected network of men who found camaraderie in their contempt for authority and their love of the outlaw life. Their crimes ranged from the petty, like stealing livestock or cheating at cards, to the outright violent, including stagecoach robberies and shootouts. Cattle rustling was their bread and butter, an operation that involved not just stealing cattle from local ranches, but also smuggling them across the US-Mexico border to evade law enforcement. impulsive, Ike was known for his frequent run-ins with the law and his volatile temper, which often led him into direct conflict with the Earp brothers. He was the kind of man who thrived on chaos, who seemed to draw energy from every slight, every insult, and every perceived injustice. His feud with the Earps was deeply personal, fueled by accusations of cattle rustling and by his belief that the Earps were out to get him. In truth, he wasn't entirely wrong. Wyatt Earp and his brothers saw Ike and his ilk as the root of Tombstone's problems, and they were determined to bring them to heel. Then there was Curly Bill Brocious, a man whose very name conjured images of violence and mayhem. Known for his wild antics and his propensity for trouble, Curly Bill was one of the more infamous members of the Cowboy gang. His reputation for violence was well earned, not least because of his accidental killing of Tombstone's marshal, Fred White, during a drunken brawl. Some said it was an accident, others a calculated act of defiance against the encroaching forces of law. Either way, Curly Bill's actions only served to deepen the divide between the Cowboys and the lawmen trying to bring order to Tombstone. Under his loose leadership, the Cowboys grew bolder, their crimes more brazen. Stagecoach robberies became common, and the air in Tombstone grew thick with tension and the threat of violence. The Clanton brothers, Ike and Billy, along with the McClory brothers, Tom and Frank, were also central players in the Cowboy gang. They were known not just for their roles in the Cowboys' illicit activities, but for their direct confrontations with the Earps. The McClorys, in particular, had a reputation for being quick to anger and quicker to draw their guns, traits that made them both feared and respected among their peers. They, like Ike and Billy Clanton, saw the Earps as interlopers, outsiders who had no business trying to impose their brand of justice on a town that had gotten along just fine without them. The McClorys and the Clantons shared a kinship, a bond forged in mutual disdain for the Earps, and a deep-seated belief in their right to live as they pleased, regardless of the law. As the months passed, the animosity between the Cowboys and the Earps only grew. The streets of Tombstone became a simmering battleground, with both sides skirmishing in saloons and back alleys, each altercation escalating the tension and inching them closer to a full-blown confrontation. One such incident at the Alhambra saloon saw Ike Clanton hurling insults at Wyatt Earp, his words slurred by whiskey, but his intent all too clear. Wyatt, never one to back down from a challenge, stared him down with the steely gaze that had made his reputation as a lawman, but the encounter ended without bloodshed. The rumour mill in Tombstone buzzed with talk of a planned ambush, a cowboy scheme to take out the Earps once and for all. Whether these rumours were true or not mattered little. The damage was done and the lines were drawn. Despite the rising tensions, there were attempts by some to mediate the conflict, to bring the warring factions to a truce. Local authorities, businessmen, and concerned citizens tried to broker peace, urging ran too deep, the pride too strong. Each side believed they were in the right, that they were defending their way of life against an unprovoked attack. For the Cowboys, the Earps represented the encroachment of Eastern values, a threat to their autonomy and their freedom. For the Earps, the Cowboys were a blight on Tombstone, a symbol of the chaos they had sworn to tame. The night before, the fateful gunfight at the OK Corral was charged with a sense of impending doom. The Cowboys had been drinking heavily, their bravado fueled by liquor and the company of their own. Ike Clanton, in particular, was in a foul mood, his anger simmering as he made threats against the Earps, vowing that the next day would bring bloodshed. The atmosphere in Tombstone was tense, a powder keg waiting for a spark. The townspeople knew that something was about to happen, that the fragile peace that had held up for so long was about to shatter. As dawn broke on October the 26th, 1881, the stage was set for one of the most infamous confrontations in Western history. The Cowboys, some hungover, and all of them spoiling for a fight, gathered in a vacant lot near the OK Corral. Across town, the Earps prepared themselves for what was to come, their minds focused, their resolve hardened by months of conflict and threats. The paths of these two groups had been converging for some time, each step bringing them closer to this inevitable showdown. And so, as the dust settled on the streets of Tombstone, both sides squared off, knowing that the next few moments would change everything. The gunfight at the OK Corral was not just a battle between men. It was a clash of ideals, a struggle for control of a town that had become a symbol of the Wild West itself. Now, let's step into that fateful day where the echoes of gunfire would forever mark the history of Tombstone and cement Wyatt Earp's place in the annals of American legend. By the autumn of 1881, Tombstone was a town on edge. The tension that had simmered between the Earps and the Cowboy gang for months was now boiling over, threatening to engulf the town in violence. October 25th, 1881 started like any other day in Tombstone, but by evening it was clear that something was different. The streets were thick with a sense of foreboding, a tangible anxiety that seemed to hang in the air. It was a day marked by heated words and drawn guns, a day when everyone in town knew that the fragile peace that had held for so long was about to shatter. The trouble began when Ike Clanton, nursing a grudge and several whiskies, started mouthing off in the saloons, openly threatening the Earps. Clanton, hot-headed and reckless, had always been quick to anger, but today his threats felt more pointed, more dangerous. "We will have a showdown in the streets of Tombstone," he was heard to say, his voice slurred but his intent unmistakable. The words spread like wildfire through the town, reaching the ears of Wyatt Earp and his brothers. It wasn't the first time Ike had talked tough, but this time there was a sense that he meant every word. That night, Wyatt, Virgil, and Morgan Earp, along with their ally Doc to discuss their options. They were lawmen, yes, but they were also brothers, bound by blood and a shared sense of duty to the town they had come to call home. They knew the Cowboys well enough to understand that this was more than just bluster. It was a promise of violence. Virgil, the town marshal, decided it was time to take action. They couldn't allow the Cowboys to continue their threats unchecked. It was a matter of principle, but also one of survival. The decision was made. They would confront the Cowboys the next day and demand that they disarm. As dawn broke on October 26th, the mood in Tombstone was tense, the air heavy with anticipation. The Cowboys, fueled by whiskey and bravado, refused to disarm, determined to stand their ground. The Earps, meanwhile, prepared themselves for what they knew would be a dangerous confrontation. Wyatt strapped on his Colt .45, his mind sharp and focused. He had faced down outlaws before, but this felt different. The stakes were higher, the risks greater. The town watched and waited, the silence broken only by the occasional shout or the clatter of a horse's hooves on the hard-packed dirt streets. Around 2:30 in the afternoon, the moment finally came. Virgil, flanked by Wyatt, Morgan, and Doc Holliday, led the way down Fremont Street toward the vacant lot near the OK Corral, where the Cowboys were known to be gathered. Their footsteps were steady, their faces grim, each man knowing that there was no turning back. Doc, a gambler with a sharp wit and a deadly aim, carried his shotgun under his coat, ready for whatever might come. As they walked, townsfolk ducked into doorways, peeking out from behind curtains, the tension in the air almost unbearable. The Cowboys were waiting, clustered together near the lot. Ike Clanton, Billy Clanton, Tom McLaury, and Frank McLaury stood defiant, their hands hovering near their guns. Ike, having been up all night drinking, looked pale and jittery, but the others were steady, their eyes hard and their mouths set in tight lines. The Earp stopped a few yards away, and for a moment time seemed to stand still. The world narrowed to that small space, every breath held, every muscle tense. The men stared each other down, the seconds stretching into eternity. Virgil Earp, speaking with the authority of his office, ordered the Cowboys to surrender their weapons. The response was immediate and unequivocal, a refusal to disarm, a refusal to back down. The die was cast, and there was no going back. The Cowboys' hands went to their guns, the Earps drew theirs, and the final walk had led them to the brink of a moment that would become legend. With the tension at its peak, the scene was set for one of the most famous gunfights in American history, a confrontation that would last mere seconds but echo through the ages. As the dust swirled around them and the sun beat down, the lines were drawn, and the fate of Tombstone would be decided in the blink of an eye. Now, let us step into the gunfight itself, a chaotic flurry of bullets and bravery that would forever define the Wild West. The vacant lot near the OK Corral in Tombstone, Arizona, had become Frank McGlory positioned themselves, ready for a fight. The two groups faced each other across a space that was scarcely wider than a single street. The tension crackled like a dry lightning storm on the horizon, and every breath seemed to draw them closer to the inevitable clash. Virgil Earp, the town marshal, made one last attempt to defuse the situation. He ordered the Cowboys to surrender their weapons, his voice steady despite the escalating danger. But the Cowboys had no intention of giving up their guns. Billy Clanton and Frank McGlory, eyes narrow and hands hovering near their holsters, were ready to fight. The standoff stretched on for what felt like an eternity. The silence so thick it could be cut with a knife. Then, suddenly, a shot rang out. The quiet shattered like a pane of glass, and all hell broke loose. The first shot fired remains a subject of debate to this day. Some say it came from the direction of the Cowboys. Others claim it was Doc Holliday who pulled the trigger. But what followed was an explosion of gunfire that turned the dusty lot into a chaotic battleground. Wyatt Earp stood firm, his Colt .45 barking in his hand as he aimed at Frank McGlory, who was trying to draw his own gun. Bullets zipped through the air, kicking up dirt and splintering wood, the sharp cracks of the revolvers echoing off the walls of the nearby buildings. The smell of gunpowder filled the air, a bitter scent that mingled with the dust and sweat. Doc Holliday, ever the gambler, wasted no time in making his move. With a shotgun concealed beneath his coat, he stepped toward Tom McGlory, closing the distance in a few long strides. Holliday's face was a mask of concentration, his eyes cold as ice. At close range, he pulled the trigger, the roar of the shotgun deafening in the confined space. Tom McGlory staggered back, a look of shock and pain etched on his face. Blood bloomed on his chest like a dark flower, and he crumpled to the ground, his hand twitching as if to grasp his fallen gun. In the frenzy, Billy Clanton managed to fire off a shot, grazing Morgan Earp. Morgan winced, but kept his focus, firing back with deadly accuracy. He aimed low, striking Billy in the chest. Billy stumbled, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. He dropped to his knees, clutching his side, yet still managing to squeeze off another wild shot that went high and wide. Frank McGlory, seeing his brother Tom go down, aimed his revolver at Holliday and fired, narrowly missing him. Wyatt, ever the calm in the storm, turned his Colt towards Frank and squeezed the trigger. The bullet struck Frank in the stomach, and he bent over, pain etched across his face, yet still struggling to raise his gun. For what felt like an eternity, but was, in reality, less than 30 seconds, the lot was a whirlwind of smoke, shouts, and gunfire. Each man moved on instinct, the training and reflexes honed over years of survival in the West, guiding their actions. Doc Holliday, having dropped his shotgun, now drew his nickel-plated revolver and aimed at Frank McGlory. Frank, still doubled over, tried to level his pistol for another shot, but hands still gripping their guns tightly. The Cowboys were defeated, their bodies strewn across the lot. Tom McGlory and Frank McGlory lay dead, Billy Clanton mortally wounded and gasping for breath, a pool of blood spreading beneath him. The immediate aftermath of the gunfight was one of shock and disbelief. Townspeople emerged from their hiding places, cautiously stepping out into the street to witness the grim scene. There was a heavy silence, a stillness that settled over the lot like a shroud. The gunfire had drawn a crowd, and now people stood in stunned clusters, whispering in hushed tones as they took in the sight of the dead and wounded. The harsh afternoon sun beat down, casting sharp shadows on the ground, the dust settling slowly back to earth. Virgil Earp, bleeding from a bullet wound to his leg, leaned heavily on his brothers for support. Morgan was clutching his side, blood seeping through his fingers, but his face was a mask of determination. Doc Holliday, miraculously unscathed despite his close-range engagement, stood apart, his expression inscrutable, his revolver still in his hand. Wyatt Earp remained uninjured, standing tall amidst the carnage, his gaze steady as he surveyed the scene. His mind was already turning to what would come next. The gunfight might have ended, but the battle for Tombstone was far from over. As the first responders arrived, local lawmen and doctors rushed to the scene, trying to assess the damage and tend to the wounded. Billy Clanton, still alive but fading fast, was carried to a nearby building where he would soon succumb to his injuries. Ike Clanton, who had fled the scene early in the fight, was nowhere to be found, having wisely chosen to save his own skin rather than face the deadly accuracy of the Earps and Holliday. The scene was chaotic, emotions running high as people tried to make sense of what had just happened. In the immediate wake of the gunfight, the streets of Tombstone were awash with rumours and speculation. Some hailed the Earps and Doc Holliday as heroes, men who had stood up to the lawlessness that threatened to consume their town. Others saw them as murderers, accusing them of overstepping their bounds and using excessive force. The lines were drawn, and the town found itself divided over what had transpired in that dusty lot. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the blood-stained dirt, it was clear that the gunfight at the OK Corral was just the beginning. The dust had barely settled, and already the repercussions were beginning to ripple out, threatening to engulf Tombstone in a new wave of conflict. The legal battles, the public outcry, and the personal vendettas that would follow promised to be as intense and unpredictable as the gunfight itself. And so, with the echoes of gunfire still ringing in their ears, the people of Tombstone braced themselves for what would come next. The aftermath of the gunfight would prove as tumultuous as the shootout itself, with old grudges resurfacing and new ones forming, as the town struggled to find a path forward amidst the chaos. As the dust settled over Tombstone, the aftermath of the gunfight at the OK Corral rippled through the town like a shockwave. The streets that had just echoed with gunfire were now filled with the hushed murmurs of townsfolk trying to make sense of the bloodshed. The sight of 3 bodies sprawled in the dirt, Tom McGlory, Frank McGlory, and Billy Clanton, was a stark reminder that violence had struck at the heart of Tombstone, and nothing would be the same again. The town's reaction was immediate and divided. For some, the Earps and Doc Holliday were heroes, men who had taken a stand against the lawlessness that threatened to consume their town. These supporters saw the gunfight as a necessary, albeit tragic, step to reclaim order from the chaos wrought by the Cowboys. They believed that Wyatt, Virgil, Morgan, and Doc had acted in the best interests of Tombstone, their actions born from a desire to protect their community from the grip of outlaws who had operated with impunity for far too long. But for others, the scene at the OK Corral was not a display of heroism, but of brutal overreach. These voices accused the Earps and Holliday of escalating tensions unnecessarily, turning a confrontation into a bloodbath. To them, the gunfight was an avoidable tragedy, a reckless display of power by men who had taken the law into their own hands. In saloons and parlours across Tombstone, debates raged. Some saw the Earps as nothing more than vigilantes, while others believed they had simply done what needed to be done. Amidst the heated public opinion, the legal and political repercussions began to unfold rapidly. The day after the gunfight, warrants were issued for the arrests of Wyatt, Virgil, Morgan, and Doc Holliday, charging them with murder. The town's justice system, already strained and prone to political influences, was thrust into the spotlight. Judge Wells Spicer presided over the preliminary hearing that would determine whether the Earps and Holliday would stand trial for their actions. In the cramped courtroom, tension hung heavy as witness after witness took the stand. The accounts were as varied as the witnesses themselves. Some swore the Earps had given the Cowboys a chance to surrender, while others insisted they fired the first shots. The defense argued that Wyatt, Virgil, Morgan, and Doc had acted in self-defense, responding to an imminent threat. Meanwhile, the prosecution painted a picture of cold-blooded killers, men who had gunned down their opponents in a fit of unchecked power. Judge Spicer, after weeks of testimony and deliberation, ruled in favour of the Earps and Holliday, stating that there was not enough evidence to charge them with murder. The decision did little to calm the divided town, and tension remained high. The legal battle had ended, but the wounds it left behind were fresh, and the town was a powder keg ready to explode. Despite the verdict, the violence of that October afternoon had set off a chain of events that could not be easily undone. The blood spilled in that dusty lot had ignited a fire in the hearts of those left behind, and the Cowboys' thirst for revenge had only just begun. As tensions continued to rise and personal vendettas simmered, Wyatt Earp's story was far from over. The real fight was just beginning, and Wyatt's Wyatt's Vendetta ride would soon carve another chapter into the legend of the Old West. In the wake of the gunfight at the OK Corral, the dusty streets of Tombstone found themselves at the centre of a legal storm. The preliminary hearing, led by Judge Wells Spicer, became a spectacle of tension and intrigue, drawing townspeople and out-of-towners alike to witness the drama unfold. Inside the cramped courtroom, the air was thick with anticipation and the clamour of whispered conversations. Everyone wanted to see how the law would weigh against the events that had left 3 men dead and the town teetering on the edge of chaos. Judge Spicer, a man known for his stern demeanour and commitment to justice, faced the formidable task of sorting through conflicting testimonies and the intense emotions that simmered beneath the surface. Over the course of weeks, a parade of witnesses took the stand. Some, with voices steady and eyes resolute, testified that the Earps and Doc Holliday had given the Cowboys a fair chance to disarm, their hands steady and calm until the Cowboys reached for their guns. Others painted a more sinister picture, claiming the Earps had acted as judge, jury, and executioner, their actions driven by a desire for vengeance rather than justice. Every account was dissected, every word scrutinised, as the courtroom became a battleground of its own. The outcome of the hearing was far from a foregone conclusion. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as Judge Spicer delivered his decision. He exonerated the Earps and Holliday, stating that there was insufficient evidence to prove murder. His ruling acknowledged the chaotic nature of the gunfight and the dangerous reputation of the Cowboys, yet it did little to calm the divided community. Instead of delivering a sense of closure, the ruling seemed only to deepen the rift within Tombstone. Some hailed the decision as a victory for law and order, a just end to a tragic but necessary confrontation. Others saw it as a gross miscarriage of justice, proof that the law in Tombstone could be swayed by influence and fear. Outside the courtroom, public sentiment swirled like a desert storm. Newspapers across the country picked up the story, each one casting the Earps and Holliday in a different light. Some headlines declared them heroes, brave men who had stood their ground against outlaws in defence of their town. Others were less flattering, branding them as murderers who had taken the law into their own hands. Justice in Tombstone was swift, but far from fair, one paper declared, reflecting the contentious nature of the legal battles that had followed the gunfight. The media frenzy only added fuel to the fire, turning the small mining town into a focal point of national debate about law, order, and vigilantism in the Wild West. As the controversy grew, so did the pressure on the Earps and their supporters. They found themselves both defended and derided, their actions dissected in saloons and on street corners, in parlours and across dinner tables. The Cowboys, who had lost friends and kin in the gunfight, simmered with rage and a thirst for revenge. They felt wronged, not only by the outcome of the gunfight, but by the ruling that seemed to sanction the deaths of their own. tension in Tombstone was as taut as a drawn bowstring, the peace as fragile as glass. The legal battles may have been over, but for the Earps, the fight was far from finished. What had begun as a defence of law and order had spiralled into a bitter, personal conflict that would soon take a darker turn. Retaliation was brewing in the air, and the Cowboys were not ones to forgive or forget. As the town braced for the inevitable retaliation against the Earps, Wyatt knew that the only way to protect his family and secure his own brand of justice was to take matters into his own hands once more. The air in Tombstone grew colder and sharper after the courtroom drama concluded, not from the weather but from the icy tension that permeated every corner of the town. Though the legal battles were over, the real war had only just begun. The Cowboys, stinging from the losses they had suffered and the humiliation of seeing their enemies walk free, were not finished with the Earps. The simmering feud was about to erupt into a violent and bloody chapter that would forever alter the landscape of the West. The first blow came on the night of December 28th, 1881. Virgil Earp, the town marshal, who had stood tall during the gunfight at the OK Corral, was walking back to his hotel after his shift. The streets were quiet, the kind of uneasy silence that made every step echo. Suddenly, out of the shadows, gunfire erupted. A flurry of shots burst forth from a darkened alley, and Virgil was struck down, his left arm shattered by a shotgun blast. He collapsed onto the cold ground, his blood mixing with the dust of the street. Though gravely wounded, Virgil survived the ambush, but his arm would never fully recover. He was left crippled, a stark reminder of the price of standing up against the Cowboys. The attack on Virgil sent a chilling message, but the worst was yet to come. Just a few months later, on the night of March 18th, 1882, the Cowboys made their most brazen move yet. Morgan Earp, the youngest of the Earp brothers, was playing billiards in a local saloon. The night had an eerie calmness to it, the kind that settles just before a storm. As Morgan leaned over the table to take his shot, the unmistakable crack of a rifle shattered the quiet. A bullet tore through the window behind him, striking Morgan in the back. He collapsed to the floor, blood spreading across his shirt as the life drained from his body. Morgan's friends rushed to his side, but it was too late. He died in their arms, his eyes wide with shock and pain. Wyatt was there too, holding his dying brother, his heart breaking and his fury rising like a storm. Wyatt Earp's frustration boiled over. The legal system had failed him, just as it had failed so many others. The attackers vanished into the night, shielded by silence and fear. Despite his efforts to seek justice through the law, the system seemed powerless to protect his family or bring the killers to account. The ambush of Virgil and the murder of Morgan were not just attacks on his family. They were a direct challenge to his very sense of right and wrong. Something inside Wyatt snapped. The law was supposed to protect, this moment of anguish and rage that Wyatt Earp made a fateful decision. He could no longer rely on the law. He would have to become the law himself. His transformation from a steadfast lawman to a relentless avenger began that night in the pool hall as he cradled Morgan's lifeless body. The resolve hardened in his eyes. He would not wait for justice to be served. He would deliver it himself, with a steely determination and a heart full of vengeance. Wyatt formed a posse of loyal friends and allies, including his trusted companion, Doc Holliday. Together, they set out on a mission to hunt down those responsible for the attacks, determined to bring them to justice or to the grave. Thus began Wyatt's Vendetta ride, a ruthless pursuit across the barren Arizona landscape that would see no mercy and no turning back. The West had never seen anything like it. A desperate man driven to the edge, abandoning the very principles that once guided him, all in the name of a justice he could no longer find in the courtrooms and jails of Tombstone. The trail ahead was long and dangerous, and Wyatt knew it would be paved with blood. With his brother's attackers still lurking in the shadows, Wyatt Earp rode out into the night, his heart as cold as the steel of his revolver. What followed would be a relentless pursuit, a vendetta that would forever change the man who once wore a badge. And so, with a band of loyal men by his side, Wyatt set out to exact his own brand of justice, where the only law was the law of survival. Wyatt Earp's Vendetta ride began like a storm brewing on the horizon, slowly at first, gathering force and fury with each passing day. Stripped of his faith in the legal system and driven by a profound sense of loss and betrayal, Wyatt set out on a mission that would take him deep into the unforgiving Arizona desert. His targets were the Cowboys, responsible for the ambush on Virgil and the murder of Morgan, men who had slipped through the fingers of justice, hiding in the rugged landscapes that they knew so well. But Wyatt knew this land too, and he was determined to use that knowledge to his advantage. The pursuit was relentless, a deadly game of cat and mouse played out under the scorching sun and the cold, silent nights of the desert. Wyatt and his posse, which included his loyal friend Doc Holliday and a handful of trusted allies, moved swiftly and decisively. They were driven by a singular purpose: to bring the Cowboys to justice, not in a courtroom, but at the end of a gun barrel. It wasn't long before the first confrontation took place, setting the tone for what was to come. Near the small mining camp of Iron Springs, Wyatt and his men caught up with a group of cowboys, and the desert erupted in a hail of gunfire. The shootout at Iron Springs was fierce and chaotic. Wyatt, with bullets whizzing past his head and kicking up dust at his feet, charged straight into the fray, his eyes cold and his aim steady. He was a man possessed, satisfaction. Yet there was no joy in this, only a cold sense of duty fulfilled. His face was set like stone, his thoughts already turning to the next pursuit. He knew that this path he had chosen was one from which there could be no return. From Iron Springs, the Vendetta ride continued, each encounter becoming more desperate and brutal than the last. Wyatt's posse moved like shadows through the canyons and valleys, following the trails left by the Cowboys. At every turn, they faced danger, not just from their enemies, but from the land itself, which offered no mercy to the men who dared to cross it. But Wyatt was undeterred. With each passing day, he grew harder, more resolved, his focus narrowing to a single point: vengeance. This is no longer about justice, it's about survival, he was said to have remarked during those dark days, a sentiment that captured his descent from lawman to avenger. Yet, even as Wyatt hunted down the Cowboys, a part of him could not help but reflect on the choices he had made and the path he now walked. He had always believed in the rule of law, in the idea that justice should be served in a courtroom, not in the street, but that belief had been shattered along with Morgan's life, and now Wyatt was left to grapple with the consequences of his actions. Each time he pulled the trigger, each time he saw another man fall, he felt a piece of his own soul slipping away. He knew he was changing, becoming something darker, something he had once sworn to fight against. The Arizona desert became a mirror of Wyatt's inner turmoil, a vast, unforgiving expanse where right and wrong seemed to blur into one. As he rode through the endless sands and rocky outcrops, Wyatt contemplated what lay ahead. The Vendetta had given him a purpose, a reason to keep going after so much had been lost. But it had also cost him dearly. The man who had once worn a badge and believed in the law now saw the world through different eyes. Eyes that had witnessed too much death, too much betrayal. Still, Wyatt Earp pressed on, driven by a force he could scarcely understand but could not resist. The Vendetta ride would carve his name into the legend of the Wild West, a testament to a man who had lost everything and had nothing left to lose. And as the ride continued, Wyatt knew that he was not just chasing his enemies across the desert, he was chasing something within himself, something that he might never find. As Wyatt's relentless pursuit drew to a close, the echoes of gunfire still ringing in his ears, he began to ponder the legacy he would leave behind. The man who had sought justice had found only vengeance, and the path ahead was as uncertain as the one behind. After the smoke cleared and the dust of Tombstone settled, Wyatt Earp left the town that had become both his battlefield and his crucible. The years following the Vendetta ride were a restless journey for a man who had seen and done more than most could imagine. Wyatt drifted across the American West, never staying in one place for too long, his wanderlust as relentless as his pursuit of justice had been. He tried his hand at mining in Colorado, looking for silver and gold in the unforgiving mountains, hoping perhaps to strike it rich. finding some success but little satisfaction in the roll of dice and the turn of cards. In California, he sought opportunity in the booming real estate markets of San Diego, always searching for the next big break, the next chance to make a name for himself that wasn't stained with gunpowder and blood. Through all these ventures, one constant remained: Josephine Marcus. The woman who had been at his side since his days in Tombstone became his partner in both life and adventure. Together they moved from town to town, state to state, living the kind of nomadic existence that seemed to suit Wyatt's restless spirit. Their relationship, like much of Wyatt's life, was shrouded in mystery and speculation, but there was no denying the bond they shared. She was his confidant and companion, the one person who truly knew the man behind the legend. As Wyatt aged, he became increasingly aware of his own mortality and the legacy he would leave behind. He knew that the stories of the West were being written, not just in history books, but in the burgeoning industry of Hollywood. Wyatt sought to control his own narrative, to ensure that his story was told on his terms. He granted interviews to journalists and collaborated with writers like Stuart N. Lake, who helped craft the image of Wyatt Earp as the quintessential frontier hero, brave, just, and unyielding in the face of danger. The West may have been won, but Wyatt Earp's story was far from over, Lake wrote, capturing the idea that Wyatt was more than just a man. He was the embodiment of a time and a place that had come to define America itself. Wyatt's efforts to shape his legacy were not without controversy. Some saw him as a self-promoter, a man trying to rewrite history to cast himself in the best possible light. Others believed he was simply telling the truth as he saw it, offering his version of events in a world where facts were often as malleable as the desert sands. Whatever the case, Wyatt's narrative began to take on a life of its own, moving beyond the dusty streets of Tombstone and into the realm of myth and legend. In the decades that followed, Wyatt Earp's name became synonymous with the Wild West. He was the subject of countless books, films, and television shows, his life story moulded and remoulded to fit the needs of each new generation. He became a symbol of the rugged individualism and frontier justice that defined the American spirit, a figure who stood tall in the face of lawlessness and chaos. His story was one of grit and determination, of a man who lived by his own code and refused to be swayed by the changing tides of fortune. But, as with all legends, the truth of Wyatt Earp's life was far more complex. Historians and scholars have long debated his true character, his motivations, and his actions. Was he a hero? A man of principle who fought for justice in a lawless land? Or was he a vigilante, a man who took the law into his own hands when it suited him, driven by a thirst for vengeance and a desire for control? He lived by the gun and he died in peace, an old man, one historian noted, capturing the paradox of Wyatt Earp, celebrated and condemned. The debate over Wyatt's legacy reflects a broader conversation about the myth of the American West itself. It is a story of heroes and outlaws, of lawmen and gunslingers, of a land where justice was often as wild as the landscape. Wyatt Earp's life encapsulates all these contradictions, a tapestry woven from threads of courage and controversy, honour and infamy. He was a man who operated in the grey areas, where right and wrong were not always clear, and where every decision carried the weight of life and death. Even as the years passed and the world moved on, Wyatt Earp remained a fixture in the American imagination. He had become a symbol of a bygone era, a time when the West was still wild and untamed, a place where a man could carve out his own destiny with nothing more than a six-shooter and a strong will. His story, with all its triumphs and tragedies, continues to captivate us, a reminder of the complexities of history and the enduring allure of the frontier. In the end, Wyatt Earp was more than just a man. He was a symbol of a time, a place, and a way of life that continues to captivate us to this day. His legacy is one of both legend and reality, a blend of fact and fiction that reflects the spirit of the American West itself. As long as stories of the frontier are told, Wyatt Earp will ride on, a figure of enduring fascination in the annals of American history. And with that, our exploration into the story of Wyatt Earp and his war against the Cowboys comes to a close. I hope you are nice and relaxed and enjoyed the video, and if you want to see more historical ASMR content, make sure to subscribe. Also, if there is a topic you would like to see covered, make sure to leave a comment below. Wherever you are in the world, I hope you have a wonderful day and or night, and as always, sleep well.